Racist cop humiliates black woman not knowing she authored the tribunal report that will erase his career tonight. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to the main character. The tribunal chamber sat on the third floor of a government building that smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, a place where careers were weighed in quiet voices and sealed with signatures rather than raised hands. Alyssa Grant stood just inside the doorway, posture straight, hands folded calmly in front of her, dressed in a charcoal blazer that blended into the room rather than demanding attention. To most people there, she looked like another summoned civilian, someone called in to explain herself and then dismissed. Officer Daniel Whitmore noticed her immediately, and not because she had done anything wrong, but because he assumed she had no right to be there. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed the room belonged to him, badge polished, voice already carrying before anyone had invited him to speak. He smirked as Alyssa took her seat, letting out a low chuckle that drew a few uncomfortable glances from the panel members. He addressed her without using her name, correcting her before she had said a single word, implying she would not understand procedure, implying that her presence was an inconvenience rather than a necessity. Alyssa did not respond. She did not shift in her chair or glance down at the floor. She looked forward, eyes steady, absorbing the room the way someone does when they already know how the story ends. Whitmore continued, filling the silence with remarks dressed up as professionalism but edged with condescension, speaking slowly as if patience were being tested, as if restraint were a favor. Papers rested on the long table between them, thick binders stamped with official seals, and as he talked, he gestured toward them dismissively, confident that whatever was written inside could not touch him. The tribunal members exchanged brief looks, the kind that lasted less than a second, but carried more weight than any comment allowed. Alyssa noticed that too. She noticed everything, the clock ticking softly on the wall, the way one panelist tapped a pen twice and then stopped, the way Whitmore's voice grew slightly louder each time no one challenged him. She had spent months listening to voices like his, transcribing patterns, documenting habits, turning moments of casual arrogance into paragraphs of undeniable record. To Whitmore, this was just another morning, another chance to assert control in a room designed to reinforce it. To Alyssa, it was the final hour of a process already complete. The irony hung in the air, unnoticed by the man who believed himself untouchable, the kind of irony that does not announce itself but waits patiently. When the chairperson finally asked Alyssa if she wished to respond, Whitmore smiled again, certain that whatever came next would be forgettable. Alyssa simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and prepared to speak with the same calm she had carried into the room, knowing that soon the narrative would shift, not through raised voices or confrontation, but through truth that had already been written and could no longer be ignored. The room settled into a controlled stillness after Alyssa Grant's first words, the kind of silence that felt deliberate rather than awkward, as though everyone present understood that this hearing was not meant to be rushed. The tribunal chamber was not large, roughly the size of a modest conference room, but it carried the gravity of decisions that could follow a person for decades. A long table stretched nearly 12 feet from end to end, separating those who judged from those being judged, and above it hung the state seal, slightly worn from years of quiet observation. Officer Daniel Whitmore shifted in his seat, crossing one leg over the other, his confidence still intact, his expression relaxed in the way of someone who believed time was on his side. He glanced at the clock mounted on the wall, calculating how soon this would be over, already imagining himself back on duty before lunchtime. Alyssa remained composed, her gaze level, her breathing steady, listening as the chairperson reviewed procedural notes in a measured voice. Each rule, each guideline, was spoken clearly, not for her benefit, but as a reminder to the room that this was a formal process, not a performance. Whitmore nodded along, occasionally smirking, occasionally letting out a quiet exhale that suggested impatience rather than concern. He assumed the documents stacked neatly before the panel were routine, another layer of bureaucracy that would ultimately protect him the way it always had. Alyssa knew better. She recognized the order of the folders, the precise alignment of tabs, the subtle way the top binder had been placed slightly forward, signaling priority. Those details had been intentional, chosen carefully long before this morning. As questions were directed toward Whitmore, he answered with practiced ease, his tone confident, almost conversational, presenting himself as a professional misunderstood rather than an officer under scrutiny. He referenced policy, experience, years on the force, each statement designed to reinforce the image he had built for himself. Alyssa listened without interruption, not because she agreed, but because she had already documented the gaps between his words and reality. The panel members took notes, their pens moving steadily, expressions neutral, revealing nothing. When the chairperson finally turned back toward Alyssa, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. The question was simple, asking her to clarify her role in the matter, yet the room seemed to lean in, as though something unspoken had reached its breaking point. Alyssa answered calmly, stating her name again, confirming her presence, offering no emotion beyond professionalism. Whitmore exhaled sharply through his nose, unconcerned, unaware that every minute passing was bringing him closer to an outcome he could no longer control. Outside the building, traffic moved steadily. People walked their dogs, coffee shops filled with the sounds of ordinary mornings, all unaware that inside this quiet room, a career was being measured not by reputation or bravado, but by words already written and evidence already sealed. Alyssa rested her hands lightly on the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips, grounded in the certainty that the process unfolding now was only the final step of something long completed. The tribunal was not deciding whether truth existed. It was deciding whether to acknowledge it. And that distinction, subtle as it seemed, was about to change everything. As the questioning continued, the atmosphere in the tribunal chamber grew denser, not louder, but heavier, as though the air itself was aware that the surface narrative was beginning to thin. Alyssa Grant remained seated, shoulders relaxed, her expression unchanged, while the panel moved methodically through their agenda. Each question was precise, each pause intentional. Officer Daniel Whitmore answered again, leaning forward now, elbows resting on the table, projecting cooperation while maintaining control. He spoke about procedures, about split-second judgments, about the pressures of the job, framing every decision as reasonable within context. His voice carried confidence, but beneath it was a subtle insistence, a need to remind everyone in the room of who he believed himself to be. Alyssa listened, eyes focused not on him but on the panel, recognizing the pattern he was repeating because she had heard it before dozens of times across transcripts, recordings, and sworn statements collected over months. The difference now was that the pattern was being observed in real time by people who could no longer dismiss it as coincidence. One of the tribunal members adjusted her glasses and asked Whitmore to clarify a timeline. Another requested he confirm details he had mentioned earlier. The questions were calm, almost gentle, yet each one narrowed the space in which his narrative could exist. Alyssa noticed the slight hesitation before some of his responses, the brief moments where his confidence paused to recalculate. She knew those moments well. They were the same moments she had highlighted in her report, the points where certainty faltered and truth revealed itself quietly. When Alyssa was invited to speak again, the chairperson asked her not for opinion, but for confirmation of facts. She responded evenly, her voice steady, referencing dates, times, and documented records without embellishment. She did not accuse. She did not argue. She simply confirmed. Whitmore glanced toward her, irritation flickering across his face for the first time, quickly masked by a tight smile. He still believed this was manageable, that his reputation would outweigh whatever this woman thought she had brought into the room. What he did not see were the panel members exchanging longer looks now, their pens moving more deliberately, their posture subtly shifting from passive listening to active evaluation. Alyssa felt the shift too, not as satisfaction, but as alignment. This was the point where process began to catch up with truth. The chairperson thanked her and moved on, requesting the final set of documents be prepared for review. A staff member placed another binder on the table, thicker than the rest, its cover unmarked except for a simple case number. Whitmore barely glanced at it, assuming. It was more of the same. Alyssa recognized it instantly. She had organized that binder herself, structured its contents to speak when she no longer needed to. As the tribunal prepared to move into deliberation, the room fell into another silence, deeper than before, not empty, but full of anticipation. Outside, the day continued as normal, unaware that inside this modest chamber, assumptions were unraveling quietly. Alyssa remained still, hands resting where they had been since the beginning, her role now clear even if it had not yet been spoken aloud. The process was doing exactly what it was designed to do, and for the first time, Whitmore sensed that control was slipping, not dramatically, not publicly, but in a way that could not be reversed. He straightened in his chair, unaware that the most important words of the day had already been written long before he walked into the room. The tension that followed did not explode but tightened, like a wire being drawn inch by inch, and Officer Daniel Whitmore felt it even as he tried to ignore it. When the chairperson invited final clarifications before a short recess, Whitmore spoke again without being prompted, his tone sharper than before, the polished confidence now edged with irritation. He questioned Alyssa Grant's qualifications indirectly, framing his remarks as concern for accuracy while implying that her understanding of law enforcement realities was limited. His words carried the weight of someone accustomed to speaking without consequence, confident that subtle dismissal would land where open hostility might not. Alyssa remained still, listening, allowing the remarks to pass without interruption. Her silence unsettled him more than any rebuttal could have. Whitmore shifted in his chair, adjusting his jacket, glancing briefly toward the panel as if seeking reassurance that they were still aligned with him. Instead, he found neutral expressions and steady gazes, the kind that neither defended nor condemned, but waited. The chairperson allowed him to finish before responding calmly, reminding everyone that the tribunal was not a debate but a review of documented facts. The words were measured, professional, but firm, drawing a boundary Whitmore was not used to encountering. Alyssa was then asked to clarify one final point related to the documentation timeline. She answered simply, referencing submission dates, review confirmations, and procedural compliance, each detail delivered evenly, without emphasis or emotion. The contrast between their approaches became impossible to ignore. Whitmore spoke to assert dominance. Alyssa spoke to establish record. One of the panel members requested the binder be opened to a specific section, and as pages turned quietly, Whitmore leaned back again, attempting to reclaim ease, though his jaw tightened slightly. Alyssa recognized the page being read, the language she had written late nights at her kitchen table, reviewing transcripts, verifying statements, ensuring that every line could stand on its own without her presence. The room absorbed the contents in silence, broken only by the faint rustle of paper. Whitmore tapped his finger once against the table, and then stopped, sensing for the first time that something was moving without him. When the chairperson announced a brief recess, instructing everyone to remain available, Whitmore stood quickly, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. Alyssa rose more slowly, maintaining her composure, stepping back slightly as staff members began preparing the room for deliberation. No one spoke to either of them. The space between them felt deliberate now, defined. Whitmore paced a short distance near the window, looking out at the street below, trying to steady his thoughts, reminding himself that he had been through reviews before, that nothing had ever stuck. Alyssa stood near the table, hands clasped loosely, eyes forward, grounded in the quiet certainty that the process unfolding was not improvisation. It was conclusion. When the panel returned, their posture had changed subtly, shoulders squared, attention focused. The chairperson cleared her throat and announced that the tribunal would proceed with formal acknowledgement of the report's authorship before moving forward. Whitmore turned back toward the table, brows furrowing slightly, curiosity mixing with unease. Alyssa remained still, prepared. The moment hovered, suspended, as the room prepared to give voice to what had already been decided on paper. The escalation had reached its peak, not through volume or confrontation, but through the unmistakable shift of authority from assumption to fact. And Whitmore, for the first time, realized that whatever came next would not be shaped by his words at all. The chairperson's announcement settled over the room with deliberate calm, and as attention turned toward formal acknowledgement, the tribunal's focus narrowed to the documents themselves rather than the personalities seated at the table. A staff member adjusted the stack of binders, aligning edges with care, and opened the primary report to its first section. Alyssa Grant recognized the structure. Immediately, not just the headings but the rhythm of the language, the careful sequencing designed to let facts speak before conclusions ever appeared. Officer Daniel Whitmore watched the movement with growing alertness, his earlier impatience replaced by a guarded stillness. He leaned forward slightly, eyes scanning the page titles as if searching for familiarity that would reassure him. The chairperson asked the staff member to proceed, and excerpts were read aloud in an even tone, each sentence measured, precise, and unadorned. Dates were referenced, procedures were cited, patterns were identified without accusation, letting consistency do the work. Whitmore shifted again, his foot tapping once before he stopped himself, realizing too late that the sound had carried. Alyssa remained composed, her posture unchanged, though inside she noted how the room responded to the clarity of the record. One panel member asked for corroboration, and another binder was opened, this one containing supplementary materials that mirrored the main report. The alignment was intentional. Each reference pointed back to a primary source. Each claim rested on documentation rather than interpretation. Whitmore's expression tightened as he recognized his own statements quoted verbatim, placed alongside policy language that exposed their inconsistencies without commentary. He cleared his throat softly, preparing to interject, but the chairperson raised a hand gently, signaling that the reading would continue uninterrupted. Alyssa's gaze remained forward, attentive but restrained, aware that the power of the moment came from restraint rather than reaction. As the staff member turned pages, the room absorbed the cumulative weight of months of review, analysis, and verification. No single line condemned. Together, they formed something unavoidable. Whitmore glanced toward Alyssa, then quickly away, uncertainty flickering across his face as he tried to place her role in what was unfolding. He had assumed she was reacting to him. He had not considered that she might have been observing him long before this hearing. The chairperson paused and asked for confirmation of authorship protocols, prompting a brief explanation of how the report had been commissioned, reviewed, and finalized. The process was described with careful neutrality, emphasizing oversight and compliance at every step. Whitmore nodded reflexively, as though agreement might restore control, though his breathing had grown shallow. Alyssa listened, recognizing her own steps echoed back through the procedural summary, each safeguard she had insisted upon now serving its purpose. When the chairperson asked whether there were any objections to the report's inclusion in the record, the room remained silent. The silence did not feel empty. It felt resolved. Whitmore opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, realizing the moment for persuasion had passed. Alyssa rested her hands lightly on the table, grounding herself in the quiet certainty that the truth no longer depended on her presence. It existed independently now, bound in pages and affirmed by process. The tribunal was not building toward a dramatic revelation. It was assembling a foundation so solid that when the final acknowledgement came, it would feel inevitable rather than surprising. The staff member marked the place where the report's authorship would be formally identified, and the chairperson signaled that this confirmation would be addressed next. Whitmore straightened in his chair, unease settling in as he understood that whatever assumption had guided him into this room was no longer shared by anyone else present. Alyssa remained still, prepared, as the tribunal moved one step closer to naming what had already shaped the outcome. As the tribunal prepared to proceed, the narrative of the room subtly shifted away from the present moment and into the quiet accumulation of choices that had led Alyssa Grant there. Months earlier, long before the hearing date was set, she had sat alone at a small dining table in her apartment, a laptop open beside neatly stacked folders, methodically reviewing records most people never saw. She had listened to audio files late into the night, replaying statements not to catch tone, but to track consistency. She had highlighted timelines, cross-checked reports, and compared them against policy language that rarely made headlines but governed every decision behind scenes. Each step had been deliberate, not driven by anger or urgency, but by patience and precision. Alyssa understood that lasting accountability did not come from confrontation. It came from structure. She knew that if every fact could stand alone, the truth would not need her voice to defend it. Back in the tribunal chamber, that discipline was evident in the way the panel interacted with the documents now laid out before them. They were not reacting emotionally. They were following a path that had been carefully built for them. Officer Daniel Whitmore sensed this change without fully understanding it. He could feel the room moving forward without him, driven by something that no longer responded to his presence. He watched as the chairperson referenced sections of the report, guiding the panel through findings that had already been reviewed independently. The process felt less like judgment and more like confirmation. Alyssa sat quietly, recognizing phrases she had written herself, each chosen to be neutral, factual, and resistant to misinterpretation. She remembered the restraint it had taken to remove commentary, to let patterns emerge through repetition rather than accusation. She had trusted that those patterns would speak louder than any single incident. Whitmore shifted again, running a hand briefly over his chin, eyes narrowing as he realized how thoroughly his own words had been contextualized. Statements he once delivered casually were now framed within a broader record, their implications clearer when viewed together. He considered interrupting, then hesitated, uncertain where he would even begin. Alyssa watched the panel members closely, noting how they leaned in at the same moments, how their pens paused over the same lines. This alignment was not coincidence. It was the result of preparation. The chairperson asked a clarifying question about methodology, and a staff member responded, outlining the review process in careful detail, emphasizing verification, oversight, and impartiality. Alyssa felt a familiar calm settle in, the same calm she had relied on throughout the investigation, the knowledge that the work had been done correctly. Whitmore nodded absently, the words washing over him as he tried to calculate outcomes rather than absorb meaning. He had always believed that authority protected itself. He had not accounted for documentation that did not need protection because it was accurate. As the tribunal moved closer to formal acknowledgement, the room seemed to contract around that inevitability. Alyssa did not rehearse what would come next. There was nothing left to prepare. The truth she had assembled no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the process. The panel was no longer asking whether the findings were sound. They were determining how to proceed now that the foundation had been laid. Whitmore exhaled slowly, sensing that the ground beneath him had shifted permanently. Alyssa remained still, grounded in the quiet certainty that the story unfolding now was not about humiliation or victory, but about the moment when careful work finally reached the light and silence proved stronger than any raised voice. The chairperson lifted her gaze from the documents and spoke with deliberate clarity, signaling the moment the room had been approaching. All along, and the tribunal shifted from review to acknowledgement without ceremony or drama. She stated that before any conclusions were entered into record, the panel would formally identify the author of the primary report guiding the proceeding, a standard protocol delivered in a neutral tone that nevertheless changed the air in the room. Officer Daniel Whitmore straightened, eyes narrowing slightly as he followed her words. expecting a name he did not recognize or a department he could mentally distance himself from. The staff member stood and referenced the report's title and case number, then paused just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle before reading the authorship line aloud. When Alyssa Grant's name was spoken clearly and without emphasis, the sound seemed to travel across the table and land squarely in the space Whitmore occupied. He blinked once, then again, his expression caught between disbelief and calculation as he turned toward her, searching her face for some sign of explanation. Alyssa did not react. She remained composed, eyes forward, posture unchanged, as though her name had been mentioned only in passing. The chairperson continued, confirming Alyssa's role in drafting, compiling, and submitting the report in accordance with tribunal standards, emphasizing independent authorship and verified oversight. Each confirmation removed another layer of doubt, replacing assumption with record. Whitmore's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, then closed again when he realized there was nothing to challenge. The information was not new to the tribunal. It was only new to him. He shifted in his seat, the confidence that had carried him into the room now replaced by a careful stillness, as though movement itself might betray uncertainty. Alyssa listened as the chairperson explained that the report's findings had already undergone preliminary review and that today's session existed to finalize acknowledgement rather than debate substance. The implication was unmistakable. The process had already moved beyond persuasion. Whitmore glanced down at the binder, recognizing passages he had dismissed earlier, now understanding that they were indicated by someone who had observed him closely, patiently, and without confrontation. The realization settled slowly, not as shock, but as an unwelcome clarity. Alyssa met his gaze briefly for the first time, not with triumph or judgment, but with calm recognition, then returned her attention to the panel. The chairperson asked if there were any procedural objections to the authorship acknowledgement. None were raised. The silence that followed was complete, not strained, but resolved. Whitmore exhaled through his nose, a sound barely audible, as he leaned back again, his earlier posture impossible to reclaim. Alyssa felt no urge to speak. Her work had already spoken. The tribunal moved forward, referencing the report by name, now attached unmistakably to its author, and outlined the next steps in measured language. Each sentence reinforced the legitimacy of the process and the inevitability of its outcome. Whitmore listened, absorbing the shift from being the one who questioned to being the one documented. Alyssa remained steady, grounded in the knowledge that the moment was not about revelation for its own sake, but about alignment, when truth, process, and accountability finally occupied the same space. The room did not erupt. There was no audible reaction. Yet everything had changed. The name had been spoken. The record had been acknowledged. And with that simple confirmation, the balance of power in the room had turned quietly, permanently, and without the need for anything further. The tribunal advanced into resolution with the same measured discipline that had defined every step before it, and the chairperson outlined the consequences not as punishment, but as procedure, each word precise and unemotional. She stated that based on the acknowledged report and corroborated records, the panel would initiate immediate administrative actions consistent with policy, including referral for internal review, temporary suspension of field authority pending outcome, and notification to oversight bodies required by statute. Officer Daniel Whitmore listened as if the language were technical enough to soften its impact. Yet each clause carried weight he could not deflect. There was no condemnation in the tone, no raised voices, only the steady cadence of a system moving forward exactly as designed. Alyssa Grant remained attentive, eyes forward, absorbing the moment not as victory, but as closure. The chairperson continued, explaining timelines, documentation transfers, and the formal entry of findings into the official record, noting that the process would proceed independently of personal statements. Whitmore's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension settling into a quiet acceptance as he realized there would be no argument left to make, no narrative left to reshape. His earlier certainty had relied on ambiguity, and ambiguity no longer existed. A panel member asked whether there were any final clarifications required before adjournment. None were offered. The silence that followed felt complete, not empty, as though the room itself recognized that its purpose had been fulfilled. Alyssa noticed how the binders were closed carefully, the covers aligned again, the materials prepared for transfer. The work had moved beyond her hands. That had always been the goal. The chairperson thanked all parties for their cooperation and stated that written notices would be issued by end of day, outlining next steps with clarity and transparency. Whitmore nodded once, a small, contained motion, acknowledging a reality that no longer depended on his agreement. He avoided looking at Alyssa, not out of hostility, but because there was nothing left to contest between them. Alyssa stood when instructed, gathering her composure with the same calm she had carried into the room, feeling the subtle shift from anticipation to completion. Staff members moved efficiently, the mechanics of conclusion unfolding without ceremony. As the panel prepared to exit, the chairperson paused briefly, emphasizing that the tribunal's role was not to assign intent, but to uphold standards, a distinction that framed the outcome as institutional rather than personal. The words landed with quiet finality. Whitmore rose as well, straightening his jacket out of habit, though the gesture felt reflexive rather than purposeful. Alyssa stepped back to allow others to pass, maintaining distance, her presence now defined not by reaction, but by authorship that had already done its work. Outside the chamber, the corridor hummed with ordinary sounds, footsteps, and distant conversation, the building continuing its routine. Whitmore paused near the doorway, reading the posted notice that confirmed adjournment, the implications settling in as he understood how swiftly the consequences would ripple through his professional life. There was no spectacle, no announcement beyond the room, yet the change was unmistakable. Alyssa moved toward the exit with unhurried steps, grounded in the certainty that accountability did not require confrontation to be effective. It required patience, documentation, and a process willing to follow its own rules. The tribunal had done exactly that. As the doors closed behind them, the record stood complete, and the outcome, already set in motion, would unfold without her further involvement. The system had spoken in its own language, and for once, it had listened to the truth written quietly long before today. The building released its occupants back into the afternoon without acknowledgement, sunlight spilling across the courthouse steps as though nothing inside had shifted. Yet for Alyssa Grant, the weight she carried into the tribunal no longer rested on her shoulders. She walked at an unhurried pace, the echo of her footsteps steady, aware that the work was finished not because a verdict had been spoken aloud, but because the process had honored its own design. Behind her, Officer Daniel Whitmore lingered near the entrance, reading a notification on his phone, the language formal and unmistakable, outlining immediate administrative changes that would take effect before the day ended. There was no crowd, no spectacle, only the quiet realization that authority once assumed had been redefined by record rather than reputation. Alyssa did not look back. She stepped onto the sidewalk where traffic moved at a predictable rhythm, people crossing streets, conversations overlapping, the ordinary world continuing without pause. For months, she had operated in that same world, unnoticed, compiling details others overlooked, trusting that consistency would eventually matter. Now it had. Whitmore watched her from a distance for a brief moment, recognizing too late that the woman he had dismissed was never reacting to him at all. She had been documenting a system that allowed dismissal to exist unchecked. The distinction settled heavily as he pocketed his phone, straightened his jacket, and turned away, understanding that the consequences ahead would not arrive with drama, but with paperwork, meetings, and decisions made without his input. Alyssa reached her car and paused before unlocking it, taking in the quiet clarity of the moment. There was no surge of triumph, no urge to celebrate. The satisfaction came from knowing that the work had not required confrontation to be effective. It had required patience, accuracy, and restraint. Inside the building, The tribunal staff finalized records, sending notifications to oversight offices, their actions methodical and impartial, ensuring the outcome would continue to unfold exactly as outlined. The report Alyssa had written now existed independently of her presence, cited by reference number rather than name, its impact measured not in headlines, but in institutional change. Whitmore drove away shortly after, navigating familiar streets with unfamiliar awareness, replaying moments he had once dismissed, now understanding how quietly accountability can take shape. Alyssa started her engine and merged into traffic, blending into the flow of commuters heading home, her role complete. The city did not mark the moment, but the ripple had begun, subtle and irreversible. Later that evening, as offices processed updates and systems adjusted, the reality of the tribunal's decision settled into place, reshaping a career without raised voices or public display. Alyssa sat at her kitchen table once more, reviewing nothing, her laptop closed, the quiet around her earned. She did not revisit the report or the hearing. There was no need. The truth had moved forward on its own. Somewhere across the city, Whitmore faced the first tangible sign of change, understanding that the authority he once wielded depended not on his belief in it, but on accountability he could no longer avoid. The contrast between them was not rooted in conflict, but in consequence. Alyssa had carried the truth patiently until it no longer required her to carry it at all. He had assumed control until control revealed its limits. The day ended without announcement, yet its echo lingered, a reminder that justice does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it enters quietly, through careful work, steady hands, and words written long before anyone thinks to listen. And when it does not ask for attention. It simply stands, undeniable, leaving those who underestimated it to reckon with the space it now occupies.